The cold of the European winter wrapped around him like a relentless predator, its icy tendrils creeping beneath his uniform, gnawing at his bones. The young officer stood motionless in the small, dimly lit cell, the weight of the silence in the air more oppressive than the harsh winds outside. It was the kind of silence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, a silence that choked the very breath from him. The room was stark, almost cruel in its simplicity, furnished with nothing but a thin cot, a small wooden table, and a single narrow window through which the light of the moon barely filtered in, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Outside, the world raged in the brutality of war, but inside the cell, there was only the gnawing stillness of fate awaiting him. His thoughts raced, darting back and forth like a trapped animal in search of an escape that did not exist. The reality of his situation weighed down on him, suffocating him with the knowledge that he was a prisoner not only of his surroundings but of his own actions. The young officer, once so confident in his duty and his loyalty, now found himself questioning everything he had ever believed in. The cold seeped into him, not just physically but mentally, as the dread of his impending punishment continued to tighten around his chest like a vice. He had once been a man of conviction, a man who fought for his country, for his comrades, believing in the righteousness of his cause. But now, that belief seemed like a distant memory, a faded echo of a life that no longer felt like his own. The accusations against him had come like a storm, swift and unrelenting, tearing apart the life he had known. Betrayal. The word echoed in his mind, sharper than any blow he had ever received, more devastating than any wound he could have suffered on the battlefield. It was a word that seemed to hang in the air like a death sentence, casting its long shadow over everything he had once held dear. The charge was not one of simple negligence or failure in duty. No, this was far worse. The betrayal was one that reached deep into the core of his identity as an officer, as a man who had sworn an oath to serve, to protect, and to lead. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being a loyal servant of the crown to someone whose very name was associated with the darkest kind of treason? In the solitude of his cell, he replayed the events that had led him here, trying to make sense of it all, though it seemed impossible. The mission had seemed simple enough at first, another order to follow, another operation to execute in the name of duty. But somewhere, deep within him, a seed of doubt had taken root. The details of the mission, the orders given, the men involved, they all began to blur together in his mind. There had been whispers, small things that he had tried to ignore, distractions that only grew louder the more he tried to suppress them. In the chaos of war, it was easy to lose sight of the finer details, easy to convince oneself that a slight deviation from the plan was justifiable, that small compromises were necessary for the greater good. But this was no small compromise. He knew that now. The whispers had grown into accusations, and the once clear line between right and wrong had become muddled, uncertain. His hand clenched into a fist as he thought of the men he had once led, the comrades he had fought alongside. How many of them would be dead now because of his decisions? How many lives had been lost because he had failed in his duty? He could feel the weight of their ghosts pressing in on him, their accusing stares burning into the back of his mind. They were not here to witness the punishment that was coming, but their presence was all around him, suffusing the air with a sense of shame that made the room feel smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were closing in. It wasn't just the lives lost that haunted him, it was the life he had lost as well. The young officer had once been a man of purpose, a man who had chosen this path knowing full well the risks, the sacrifices that came with it. He had stood proud in his uniform, believing that he was part of something greater than himself. The ideals of honor, duty, and loyalty had once filled him with a sense of pride that transcended fear or doubt. But now, standing in this cold, isolated cell, all of those ideals felt like lies. He had betrayed them all. And the worst part was, he didn't know how or when it had happened. It had been so gradual, so insidious, that by the time he had realized what he had done, it was already too late. The young officer had never imagined that a moment like this would come. He had read about men like him, officers who had faltered, who had failed their comrades in ways that could never be undone, but he had never thought it would be his story. The possibility of such a fall had always seemed so distant, so foreign. He had believed in the strength of his own resolve, in the clarity of his purpose. But now, standing at the edge of his downfall, he could see just how fragile that resolve had been. It had been too easy to let the small compromises accumulate, too easy to dismiss the doubts that had crept in like a slow poison. And now, there was no escaping the consequences. The dread that filled him now was not just the fear of punishment, but the fear of something deeper, something more profound. What would be left of him after this? The man who had once been a soldier, a leader, a protector, now found himself reduced to something unrecognizable. His identity, his very sense of self, was crumbling under the weight of his own actions. How could he ever look at himself in the same way again? How could he stand before the men he had once led, knowing that he had failed them so completely? The cold continued to seep in, but it was nothing compared to the coldness that had settled deep within him. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps outside the cell, a reminder that time was moving, that the world outside was still turning. But in this moment, in this frozen prison of his own making, it felt as if time had stopped. There was nothing left to do but wait, to endure the silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And yet, as he stood there, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest, he realized that the true punishment was not the one he would soon face at the hands of his captors. The true punishment was the one he had already inflicted upon himself, the one that would remain long after the walls of this cell had faded into memory. He had shattered everything he had once believed in, and no amount of punishment could ever undo that. The dread of what was to come, the certainty of the punishment that loomed, was nothing compared to the crushing weight of his own guilt. The silence of the room was only broken by the steady beat of his own heart, a reminder that he was still alive, still breathing, still capable of feeling the depth of his shame. And as he prepared himself for whatever judgment awaited him, he realized that the real punishment had already begun. It was not the inevitable pain, but the slow unraveling of everything that had once given his life meaning. It was the knowledge that he had betrayed not only those around him, but the very ideals that had once defined who he was. The tribunal room was vast and imposing, the very architecture of the space designed to instill a sense of solemnity, a sense of gravity. The high, arched ceiling seemed to stretch into eternity, as though mocking the fleeting nature of the lives and fates that unfolded within its cold, stone walls. The long table at the center, dark and polished, was surrounded by a row of men, each wearing the uniform of authority, their faces cold and unreadable. They were not just officers, they were the embodiment of the system, of the empire that had sent him to war, and now, in the aftermath of his actions, they were his judges. The officer, still bound in his military garb, stood at attention just beyond the threshold of the room, his mind a swirling maelstrom of fear and guilt. He could barely register the details of his surroundings, his mind far too consumed by the weight of the moment. Every second that passed seemed to stretch on forever, dragging the young officer deeper into a state of dread and uncertainty. The atmosphere was suffocating, too quiet, too still, and yet there was a sharpness in the air, as if every breath, every movement, was being scrutinized. The officer's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the next, as though it could be heard by the men in the room, each thud reminding him of his presence, his failure, his impending fate. His eyes flickered across the faces of the men seated at the table, but there was nothing to read in their expressions. They were a sea of stern, unflinching faces, each one betraying no emotion. No anger. No pity. Just the cold, unfeeling presence of authority. The weight of their gaze felt as though it were crushing him, bearing down on him from all sides. His body was rigid, his back straight, his hands at his sides, but inside he was trembling, not just from the chill of the room but from something far deeper, something far more unsettling. The tribunal was not a place for emotion, not a place where the individual could be seen or heard. It was an institution, a machine designed to grind up those who had fallen short, who had broken the unspoken code. He was a cog in that machine now, and in this moment he understood just how powerless he truly was. There was no defense here, no chance for redemption. There was only the cold, mechanical execution of justice. whatever that meant in a world as fractured and brutal as the one they had created. The young officer's thoughts drifted to the charges against him. The words still stung in his mind: treason, disloyalty, failure. He had betrayed the very ideals he had once sworn to uphold. He had crossed the line from loyal servant of the crown to someone unworthy of the trust placed in him. And yet, in the stillness of the tribunal room, it was impossible to tell whether the accusations were truly just. The officer knew what had transpired, the choices he had made, the actions he had taken that had led him to this moment. But could anyone truly understand the pressures, the fears, the confusion that had driven him? The room offered no answers, no room for nuance. Here, everything was black and white. A man was either loyal or he was not. He had either upheld the code or he had broken it. The tribunal chairman, a man of gray hair and an even grayer face, finally broke the silence. His voice was low, steady, and devoid of emotion, as if he had said the same words countless times before, each one as hollow as the next. He spoke the young officer's name, and it sounded like a sentence, an echo of doom that reverberated through the room, a sound that made the young officer's breath catch in his throat. He stood there, still as a statue, but inside, his mind was racing. He could not speak, not now, not in front of these men who held his fate in their hands. He had been trained to withstand interrogation, to hold his composure in the face of adversity, but this was different. This was not the sharp, immediate violence of battle. This was the cold, deliberate cruelty of bureaucracy, of a system that cared little for the lives it crushed in its wake. The chairman continued, his words falling into the silence like stones into water, rippling outward, each word cutting deeper. The officer was accused of failing in his duty, of acting against the interests of the very people he had sworn to protect. But the officer knew in his heart that it was not just the mission that had failed, it was something deeper, something within him. Something that had shifted, slowly, imperceptibly, until it was too late to turn back. It was the betrayal of something far more important than any order or directive. It was the betrayal of himself, of the very values that had once defined his purpose. As the charges were read aloud, the officer's mind seemed to retreat further into itself. The words were not new to him. He had heard them all before, countless times, in the whispers of his comrades, in the accusations that had followed him since his failure. But hearing them now, in the sterile, emotionless setting of the tribunal, made them feel more real, more immediate. The weight of their truth was undeniable. He could not escape the reality of what he had done, the lives he had impacted, the trust he had shattered. The tribunal did not care about the reasons behind his actions, the fears that had driven him to make the decisions he had made. They cared only about the outcome, about whether he had upheld the honor of his uniform or failed it. The tribunal members exchanged looks, each one seeming to pass judgment silently, their eyes flicking between the officer and the papers in front of them. Their faces remained unreadable, their thoughts obscured behind the veil of military protocol. There was no emotion in the room, not from them. There was no anger, no sympathy, no judgment, just the hollow echo of procedure. The officer realized, with a sickening clarity, that he was not a man to them. He was a case, a file, a statistic. His life, his suffering, his shame, they were all irrelevant. What mattered was that the system had to continue, unbroken, unyielding. He was just one more casualty in a war that had already claimed so many. As the tribunal chairman continued, outlining the potential consequences of his actions, the officer's mind began to slip away. His thoughts were no longer with the room, no longer with the men who sat in judgment. Instead, they were elsewhere, drifting through a fog of memories, of moments before the storm. He thought of the comrades he had lost, the missions he had undertaken, the trust he had once felt in the men around him. He thought of the promises he had made to himself, to his comrades, to his country. Where had those promises gone? Where had the idealism, the sense of purpose, the unwavering belief in the righteousness of his cause gone? He had been consumed by doubt, by fear, by a creeping sense of disillusionment that had eroded his resolve, one small compromise at a time. The tribunal was still ongoing, but the officer no longer heard the words. They were meaningless to him now. His fate had been sealed the moment he stepped into that cell, the moment he chose a path that led him to this tribunal, to this reckoning. He would not be spared. He had no illusions left. The question was no longer whether he would be punished, it was how. The tribunal was not a place for mercy, not a place where the frailties of the individual were given consideration. It was a place for justice, cold, unfeeling, mechanical justice. And that was all that awaited him now. He knew that the outcome of the tribunal was already decided. It did not matter how much he tried to explain himself, how much he tried to make them understand the pressure he had been under, the fear that had clouded his judgment. There was no room for understanding here, no room for context or compassion. There was only the judgment of the system, and the young officer was a casualty of that system. The men before him, as unfeeling as they were, had already made up their minds. They had already passed judgment. His fate was now in their hands, and there was nothing left to do but accept it. The tribunal would decide his punishment, and in that moment he understood that it would be just no more, no less. The officer sat alone in his cell, his body numb from the cold and his mind clouded with a fog of confusion and despair. Time seemed to stretch into infinity, the days blending together in a monotonous cycle of solitude and self-recrimination. Each moment that passed felt like an eternity, dragging him deeper into the darkness of his own thoughts. The harsh winter air from outside seeped through the cracks in the walls, adding to the oppressive chill in the room. He had long stopped noticing the cold. His body had become accustomed to it, just as his mind had grown accustomed to the never-ending weight of guilt and regret that settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had been a soldier, once. A man of purpose, of duty, of honor. These were the things he had believed in when he first joined the ranks, when he swore his oath to defend his country, to protect those around him, and to fight for a cause greater than himself. He had stood proud, his uniform crisp, his mind clear. He had known who he was, and what he was fighting for. But now, in the quiet solitude of his cell, that certainty felt like a distant memory, a faint echo of a man he could no longer recognize. What had happened to him? How had it come to this? He had never imagined that he would find himself in such a place where the walls seemed to close in on him with every passing moment. He had always believed that he was stronger than this, that his sense of duty would never falter, that his resolve would always carry him through the darkest times. But now, in this cold, lonely room, he realized how fragile that resolve had been. The cracks had started to appear long before the accusations had been made, long before the betrayal had been uncovered. He had seen them, but he had ignored them, pushed them aside, convinced himself that everything would work out. After all, war was a brutal and unforgiving thing. It had its own rules, its own logic. Sometimes, sacrifices had to be made. But now, in the stillness of his confinement, he understood the full extent of those sacrifices, what they had cost him, and what they had cost the men who had followed him. His thoughts began to drift back to the mission, to the days before everything had gone wrong. It had seemed so simple at the time, so straightforward. Another operation, another order to follow. He had done it many times before, and it had always been the same. Clear, concise, the goal always in sight. But this time, there had been something different. A feeling, a nagging doubt, had crept into his mind as the operation unfolded. At first, he had dismissed it, chalked it up to the stress of the situation, the weight of the responsibility he carried. But as the hours passed, that feeling had only grown stronger, more insistent. It was as if something was off, something was wrong. But by then it was too late to turn back. The mission had spiraled out of control, not through any grand mistake, but through 1,000 small missteps. Each choice, each decision, had seemed inconsequential at the time, but in the end, they had added up, each one compounding the next until it was too late to fix. It wasn't just the mission that had failed, it was him. He had failed. And he had known it even as it was happening, even as the situation slipped further and further out of his control. The first moment of doubt had been the seed, but it was the hesitation, the refusal to act with certainty, that had led them down this path. He could still hear the voices of his men, their confusion, their frustration, their fear. He had seen it in their eyes as they looked to him for guidance, for reassurance, and he had failed to give them either. The failure had been more than tactical, it had been moral. In that moment, he had made choices that went against everything he had ever believed in. The compromises had seemed small, at first, insignificant even, but as they built upon each other, they began to erode the very foundation of his integrity. He had allowed himself to be swayed by the pressure, by the need to succeed at any cost. He had rationalized his decisions, telling himself that it was necessary for the greater good. But now, sitting in his cell, he could no longer justify those choices. The weight of the consequences had become unbearable. It was not just the failure of the mission that haunted him, it was the realization that he had betrayed the very essence of what it meant to be a soldier, to be a leader. He had broken the trust of his men, and in doing so, he had broken himself. The isolation was unbearable. The silence in the cell seemed to mock him, amplifying his sense of guilt and remorse. There was no one to talk to, no one to listen to his side of the story. The tribunal had already made its judgment, and there was nothing left but to wait for the inevitable. But the waiting was the worst part. It wasn't the punishment that terrified him, it was the silence, the endless hours of reflection that forced him to confront his actions in their fullest, most unforgiving light. The questions churned in his mind, each one more damning than the last. Could he have done things differently? Should he have acted sooner? Could he have avoided the betrayal, or was it always inevitable, a product of the pressures of war, of the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men? As the days passed, the officer's sense of self began to fray. The man who had once been so sure of his mission, so sure of his purpose, now felt like a stranger to himself. The honor he had once prided himself on seemed like a distant memory, a fleeting illusion that had shattered the moment he had chosen to betray it. He thought of the men who had followed him into battle, the soldiers who had trusted him to lead them, to protect them. How many of them were gone now? How many had paid the price for his mistakes? And how many of them had died believing that he had failed them? The officer had failed not just in his duty, but in his very identity as a leader. It was the hardest truth to face, that the very essence of who he was had been tainted by his actions. He was no longer the man he had once been. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders, heavier than any burden he had ever carried. The passage of time in the cell had a way of stripping away everything, every illusion, every defense. In the absence of external distractions, the officer was forced to confront the stark reality of his own failure. There was no escape from it. The silence of the room mirrored the silence in his soul, a deep, cavernous emptiness that could not be filled. He had always believed that the greatest danger on the battlefield was the enemy, the external threat. But now he understood that the true danger was within. The true battle was against the self, against the temptation to compromise, to ignore the voice of conscience in favor of expedience. He had lost that battle, and in doing so, he had lost himself. The young officer knew that the punishment was coming, but it no longer seemed as important as the quiet, internal punishment he was already enduring. His own mind had become his jailer, his thoughts the chains that bound him to this wretched existence. The cold of the cell was nothing compared to the cold that had settled in his heart. The fear of the tribunal, the fear of what was to come, was insignificant now. What mattered was the realization that he had shattered the very ideals that had once given his life meaning. He had betrayed his comrades, his country, and, most tragically, himself. The punishment would come in time, but the true punishment had already begun. It was the punishment of knowing that he had become someone he no longer recognized, someone whose actions could never be undone. And that was the cruelest fate of all. The officers stood motionless as the words of judgment rang out in the tribunal room, their finality cutting through the thick air like a blade. He had known that this moment would come, that he would eventually have to face the consequences of his actions. But the reality of it, the coldness of it, struck him harder than he had ever imagined. The tribunal's decision was swift, unemotional, and devoid of the dramatic flair he had perhaps expected in his darkest imaginings. There was no rage, no condemnation in their voices, just the hollow, impersonal tones of men who had passed judgment 1,000 times before, and would likely do so 1,000 more. His fate was sealed in a few brief words, and in that moment he understood that nothing in the world could change it. The punishment was inevitable. The question was not whether he would suffer, it was what form that suffering would take. He had braced himself for something far harsher. His mind, in the long, lonely hours in his cell, had conjured up countless scenarios, visions of violent punishment, of pain so excruciating that it would strip him of his identity. But none of that came. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: the restraint, the calmness, the eerie silence that seemed to pervade the tribunal's decision. The punishment would come, but it would not be the kind of physical torment he had feared. There would be no screams, no blood, no visible scars. Instead, the punishment would be a kind of death, a slow, calculated death of the soul. He had thought that once the judgment was rendered, once the punishment began, there would be a release from the suffocating tension that had built up within him. But now, standing on the edge of his fate, he realized that this was not the case. The punishment, in its coldness and its silence, was not something that could be measured by physical pain. It was the punishment of being left to contemplate his own guilt, to stew in his mistakes until they consumed him entirely. The tribunal had no need to unleash a torrent of fury or vengeance. They had already done their work, and the rest would be carried out by the officer's own mind, by his own heart. The officers in the tribunal room had remained stoic, their faces unreadable as they pronounced the sentence. They had offered no sympathy, no understanding. They did not care for the man who stood before them, they only cared for the system. The machine of justice had been set in motion, and nothing could stop it now. The officer had been nothing more than a cog in that machine, his personal suffering irrelevant in the face of the greater good. The truth was, the tribunal was not concerned with his pain. They were concerned only with ensuring that the system of war, of hierarchy, of duty, continued without disruption. His punishment was not a personal vendetta, it was a necessary function of the system. And that was the part that haunted him most. As he was led out of the tribunal room and back to his cell, the officer could not shake the feeling that something far more insidious than the punishment itself was at work. There was no cruelty in the way he was treated, only indifference. The men who had passed judgment on him were not interested in his suffering. They were interested only in the preservation of order, of the rigid framework that governed their world. In their eyes, he was simply a failure, an anomaly in a system that had no place for such weakness. And so, they had passed their judgment with cold detachment, as if his fate were nothing more than an afterthought in the greater machinery of war. The officer returned to his cell, and as he sat in the dim light, the full weight of his situation began to settle in. There would be no reprieve. The punishment he had feared was not the one he had imagined, but something far worse. There would be no immediate violence, no dramatic moment of reckoning. The punishment would be far more subtle, far more insidious than anything he had expected. It would be a punishment of the mind, of the spirit, of the very soul. The tribunal had not sought to break him physically, instead, they had left him to break himself. And that was the most cruel form of punishment of all. The officer's mind raced as he sat in the cold silence of his cell. He thought of the men who had once served under his command, the men who had looked to him for guidance, for leadership. They were not here to witness his punishment. They were not here to see the consequences of his actions. But in his mind, they were all around him, their faces filled with disappointment and judgment. He could hear their voices, their accusations, echoing through his thoughts. They had trusted him, and he had betrayed that trust. How could he ever face them again? How could he ever look at them in the same way after what he had done? He had always prided himself on being a leader, on being someone who others could rely on. He had never once imagined that he would be the one to betray those who had followed him. He had been the one to hold the line, the one to make the hard choices, the one who had carried the weight of responsibility for the lives of those under his command. And now, that weight had become a crushing burden, one that threatened to suffocate him. The punishment was not just the loss of his position, the loss of his rank, the loss of his reputation, it was the loss of everything that had once defined him as a man. He had no idea who he was anymore, what he had become. In the quiet of the cell, he began to realize something he had never truly understood before. The greatest punishment of all was not physical pain. It was the loss of purpose, the loss of identity. When a man is stripped of everything that gives his life meaning, he is left adrift, lost in a sea of emptiness. This was what the tribunal had taken from him. They had not broken his body, but they had shattered his soul. The punishment had already begun, and it would not end until he had confronted the full extent of his betrayal. It was a punishment he could not escape, a punishment that would follow him for the rest of his life. He thought of the other officers, the men who had passed judgment on him, and for the first time he understood them. They were not his enemies, not in the way he had once thought. They were simply men who had been swallowed by the same system that had now claimed him. They were the product of a world that valued duty over honor, order over compassion. They had no room for weakness, no tolerance for failure. They had done what they believed was necessary to preserve the integrity of the system, to protect the larger cause. And in doing so, they had sentenced him to a kind of punishment far worse than anything he had ever imagined. They had left him alone with himself, with the consequences of his actions, to confront the man he had become. As the days stretched on, the officer came to realize that there would be no quick end to his suffering. The punishment would not come in the form of a single event, but rather in the slow, agonizing process of self-reflection. He would be forced to confront his guilt, his failure, his loss of purpose. There was no escape from it. And that, he now understood, was the most unbearable form of punishment of all. The tribunal had done their part. Now, the true punishment would come from within. It would be a punishment that would last far longer than any physical torment could ever last. A punishment that would consume him, slowly but surely, until there was nothing left of the man he had once been. Days blurred together in the confined, cold space of his cell. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, stretching endlessly, with each moment feeling like an eternity. He no longer felt the sharp pang of fear that had consumed him at first, nor the raw anger at being trapped in this suffocating place. Instead, there was a quiet, insidious kind of numbness, a resignation that slowly, imperceptibly took over. The days felt like they were slipping through his fingers, leaving behind only a quiet emptiness. It wasn't the physical deprivation he had expected, nor the constant awareness of his punishment. It was the profound sense of being cut off from everything that had once anchored him in the world. From purpose, from camaraderie, from the identity he had spent so many years building. The silence around him became the only constant, the only companion in the stark loneliness of his prison. At first, he had tried to occupy himself, to hold on to some semblance of routine. But as the days dragged on, that too became increasingly meaningless. The very act of waiting for something, anything, seemed pointless. The routine of waking up each day, with no sense of time or direction, had become a ritual of repetition, devoid of significance. He would stand by the narrow window, trying to catch a glimpse of the outside world, but it was always the same, gray skies, distant sounds that barely filtered into the room, and an unchanging landscape that felt as trapped as he was. The isolation was absolute, and with it came an overwhelming sense of disconnection. It was as if the world outside had continued to spin, indifferent to the man who had once been part of it. And now, inside this cold, lonely cell, he was nothing more than a ghost. He had long stopped thinking about the specifics of his punishment. What had once been a source of dread, a terrifying specter of physical retribution, had faded into the background, becoming almost irrelevant. The true punishment, he realized, was not the one he had feared, the physical torment that his mind had so often conjured in his most anxious moments. It was the slow erosion of his sense of self, the disintegration of everything he had once held dear. He had been a soldier, once, a man of honor, of duty, of discipline. He had lived and breathed for the mission, for the men under his command, for the belief that he was part of something larger than himself. But now, in this empty, silent room, all of that had vanished. The uniform, the rank, the purpose, everything that had once defined him, had been stripped away, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who no longer knew who he was. The young officer's thoughts became increasingly fragmented, his sense of identity slowly dissolving with each passing day. He had never truly realized until now how much of himself had been bound up in the role he had played for so long. He had thought that the uniform, the the structure of duty had made him who he was, but now he was confronted with the unsettling truth that without those things, without the clear lines of military order and purpose, he was adrift in a world that had no place for him. He had been trained to serve, to follow orders, to fight with discipline and honor.